Hello, hello, everyone. Today is July 7th. This is the first official meeting of the enhancement subproject for SIG architecture. Rah, rah, rah. This is a meeting that is recorded and available on the internet, so please be mindful of what you say and do. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and in general, just be awesome people. So we've got a few items on the agenda, but we have only a few people here. So I think what would be worthwhile is maybe we go around the horn really quickly and do some introductions, talk about why we're here. So I'm going to go from what's on my screen. John, you're up first.
Okay, sure. John Balameric. I am one of the chairs of SIG Architecture and have been also enhancement shadow for 118 and 119. And so I'm really interested in making the process smoother for how we handle CAPs, just improving the discoverability of CAPs. One of the things that in SIG Architecture we tried to do a while back was start to review some of the CAPs to try and find ones that were like either good ideas that were lost because maybe the person pushing them forward wasn't well known in the community. Sometimes that means people don't spend as much time on something, or things that maybe we were concerned might be an idea that sounds good on the surface but might cause problems and we want to sort of course correct early. And we had a really hard time finding good CAPs in flight and understanding what stage they were in through the process. And so that kind of instigated a desire to work on improving the discoverability and the management of CAPs. And there was a lot of work already done previously, or planning work done, but that was never finished. So that was helpful in that regard, and we thought we'd do that. So that was one of the motivations for this. Another one for me is the production readiness work we're doing in SIG architecture and building the right tooling to manage the CAP kind of through its gates. So that's kind of where I got involved.
Awesome, thank you, John. Next up is Bob.
I am one of the chairs of SIG Contributor Experience, a current release lead shadow, former enhancements lead, and I sort of have been iteratively working on improving enhancements on mostly the tracking sheet and some of the other stuff for a bit now. And this all sort of just seems the logical conclusion of a lot of those efforts. But you know, CAPs are something that touch a lot of people in the Kubernetes community, and helping improve that process will make it better for a contributor experience for everyone.
Awesome, thanks, Bob. Jeremy, you're up next.
Hey, Jeremy Rickard. I am also currently release lead shadow and previously led the enhancements sub-team for the release team. I think my experience has made me really interested in making the CAP process a little bit better and a little bit more discoverable, like John mentioned. Having gone through a couple of cycles doing like enhancements tracking for the releases, I definitely feel like there's areas where we can make things better, make it easier for people to find things, have a better understanding of what's going to be in the release and what's not going to be in the release, and just have a little bit more automation and like official buy-in around things rather than triaging through GitHub comments on issues. So I'm pretty excited to see what we can do inside of the sub-project. I'm particularly interested in seeing what kind of tooling we can build. I like to build tooling to make experience better for people. That's pretty much it for me.
Cool, and thank you, Jeremy. And Nabarun.
Hi everyone, Nabarun here. So I'm currently leading the enhancements team of the 1.19 release cycle. Have been shadow for the previous two release cycles, 1.17 and 1.18. Apart from that, I help in maintaining the Kubernetes Python client. And yeah, so here to help out with any enhancements related tooling change process, since there are a lot of ways we can like improve things, making it a better experience for the KEP authors, people who have to manage the KEPs, and so on. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks everyone for initiating this sub-project in the call. Thanks.
Thank you, Navarun. So I guess I'll go last. My name is Stephen Augustus. I get around the community. I am a former features lead before we started calling these things enhancements. So for the previous release team, one of the emeritus SIG PM chairs, as well as one of the SIG release chairs. So my focus for quite a while has been in and around KEPs. I think that the way that KEPs dovetail with the way that enhancements dovetail with the release process with SIG architecture, with the overall state of the world for the project is extremely important. Because this is kind of the ingress point to the release cycle. I think that it's important that we get this right. We've had, as Bob mentioned, we've had difficulties with the tracking spreadsheets in the past. This is one of the first things that I remember talking with Ihor about when I was shadowing and saying, we need to burn the sheet to the ground. Like seriously, like this needs to not exist. We need to service portions of the release process with automation, getting the right people in place, defining the right process for doing these things, and then building tooling around that. And ultimately, that is not a spreadsheet. So I'm excited to see the journey that we're on right now. For those that are familiar, been championing the KEP process for quite some time. In SIG PM, we initially spun features and what they were called features at the time, the repo out from SIG architecture over to SIG PM. Carried it in SIG PM for a while, retired SIG PM more recently, transferred the sub-project now known as enhancements back to SIG architecture, put together a bunch of really awesome people in the same room. So as sub-project owners, it's myself, Bob, Jeremy, and John. So I think we have a wealth of knowledge across multiple release cycles, a lot of lessons about what not to do when learning how to build, maintain, review, approve KEPs. And I think that overall that's going to lead to some nice net improvements as we move through the sub project. So this is, I think we've got a group with us on the call today that is kind of the I guess this is the core group, the core group of previous enhancements leads, as well as sub project owners and the current enhancements lead. So moving forward, I definitely want to bump this meeting, promote it, however y'all see fit to do so. Definitely want to get more voices in the room for reviewers, approvers, people who touch the process overall. Now, I didn't prepare a speech or anything, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about both history and vision for this sub-project. And really, this is, if you think from the program product management perspective, one of the questions that we often get when speaking to the media or speaking to maybe people internally, product marketing, so on and so forth, is what's the Kubernetes roadmap, right? And I think that if you ask any one contributor, the answer will be different. The answer is that there is no answer. We have never been able to elicit a concrete Kubernetes roadmap across release cycles, and it's something that sort of manifests itself as the cycle happens, right? You know, so as we do enhancement collection, we get an idea. So enhancement collection is one of the first parts of the release cycle. It's essentially, and just providing some context for people who are not familiar with the release team or some of the process. We establish a release team on the SIG release side. The release team is composed of a bunch of different roles. One of the roles is the enhancement sub-team, and the enhancement sub-team is responsible for collating the enhancements as well as kind of essentially cat herding the enhancement owners for the cycle, making sure that those enhancements stay up to date, that owners are familiar with the various deadlines for the release cycle, and hopefully making sure that those enhancements remain in the release cycle and removing them if they don't. So I think it's important to step back for a second and just talk about like enhancement versus feature, right? What's the difference, and why do we call them enhancements now instead of features? Features are, I think this distinction that we made a while back now was important. So features are units of work that can be executed within the scope of one release cycle, right? So just that's the definition, right? Features, units of work that can be executed within one release cycle. Enhancements are essentially proposals, larger changes to the overall, they can be process changes, they can also be code changes, right? So enhancements are larger efforts of work. They may be composed of multiple features, and they need to be executed across multiple release cycles, right? So the way that we track that effort is much different from the way that we might track an effort for a feature that can be executed in one cycle, right? So the primary way that we do some of this tracking is through a document called a KEP, right? A KEP is a Kubernetes enhancement proposal. KEPs are inspired, you know, from a variety of places. Design proposals overall, if you've seen the previous design proposals that we had in the Kubernetes community repo, it's partially inspired from that. It's partially inspired from the Rust RFCs, partially inspired by the Python PEPs. So this is kind of like a accumulation of knowledge acquired from multiple places. And I think that we've somewhat made the process our own. It's been very interesting to see the adoption across multiple places. You know, we kind of have the some sub projects that have adopted this. So if you look at the CAEPs, right? Those are the cluster API enhancement proposals, right? So they use a lighter weight version of the KEPs to track some of their features. We have internally, we use this at VMware, a version of this stuff at VMware for proposing process changes. And then I know that Kudo Builder, another CNCF project, also uses KEPs. KEPs are Kudo Builder enhancement proposals for their project. And Bob is saying that Red Hat also uses this to some extent. So I think that it's I think that it's a process that has had a lot of influence in the community across the last few years. It's something that we're consistently getting better at. There are always opportunities for improvement, but I think that definitely in the recent days, we've laid the groundwork for some really cool things moving forward. We've started to bring in, so Chuck Ha worked on a validation tool. He worked on a command line tool to search KEPs, which became part of that became the library that we use now for validation within the K enhancements repo. And we're also building tooling around that to do validation of the metadata templates that we have for KEPs, and that will eventually evolve into doing validation for the website that we produce or the various reports that we generate against KEPs. So I think laying the framework of having good metadata for KEPs, and then being able to build tooling around it to use it in multiple places is part of the goal. I think that the hope is to also make people understand the process better, bring more voices into the process to help with improvements. The interesting points about the process, like the production readiness reviews, that the hope with the production readiness reviews is that we become more confident in the enhancements that we're producing across release cycles and how they may be leveraged in production environments, right? So bringing the knowledge base of the various operators and maintainers in the community to essentially vet these enhancements. Saying, you know, is this something that can be well observed, right? What are the failure states for this type of enhancement? How do we back out of those things, right? Making sure that this is something, that any one enhancement is something that could be run in production, right? So that's would you say that that's accurate, John? Brass overview.
Yeah, that sounds good. Monitoring, I mean, you got to be able to, yeah, and then we also have scalability, right? We look at, we make people think through the scalability implications of their enhancement, which sometimes are non-obvious.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see how a enhancement behaves over a few node cluster versus a 5,000 node cluster, right?
Right.
And you know, the scalability stuff gets interesting too, because there's a need for us as community members to be able to provide in some ways the infrastructure to be able to make sure that we can test against these enhancements. So it's not easy for anyone to just spin up a 5,000, 10,000 node cluster. So if we're going to so if we review things for scalability, we also have to have the means to allow people to test against those assumptions. So a lot going on. I think that that was some of the background. There is way more that I could honestly talk hours for, but I won't do. But I want to draw some of the vision overall, and this is vision that I've had from SIG PM days, earlier in SIG release days. I want us to get to the point where we can elicit a project roadmap, right? And this only comes from, you know, this is not an enhancements problem. This is not a release team problem. This is not a architecture problem. This is a community-wide problem that our reviewers and approvers are overburdened. They're involved in a variety of different places, and they're often one of a few people that can do the thing that they do. And improve the thing that they can improve. So we need to find ways, and this is not just within this sub-project, this is all across the community. We need to find ways to defray the burden from reviewers and approvers, right? So that they can focus, so we can have more contributors focusing on tactical, and we can have more reviewers and approvers focusing on strategic goals for the community. And part of that is eliciting the project roadmap, right? The reason I mention oversubscription is if you have more time to focus on strategy, you have more time to think about what your SIG wants to do over the next few cycles, which means you have more time to report out what your SIG wants to do over multiple cycles, which means people like enhancements and the release team and SIG release and SIG architecture have more time to aggregate what your SIG, what your SIG and what multiple SIGs might be doing over multiple cycles. And that's, that's definitely oversimplifying it, but that's how we get a roadmap, right? That's by giving people more time to understand what they might want to accomplish for the next few months, for the next year, for the next few years, and putting that all together, right? We also want to put it together in a way that is uh, not prone to human error, right? So deriving this information from automation, right? And part of the way that we're planning on doing that is using the metadata within KEPS to get that done, right? So there is a field, or there are a few fields that we recently added to KEPS. One is the milestone struct. The milestone struct is composed of so it's milestone and then also alpha, beta, stable, right? And then there's also the latest milestone field, and the latest milestone field is essentially the field to let you know what's the most recent milestone that this KEP was touched in, right? So if you think about various queries that you could run over that that information, right? With the current milestone, I have an idea of last updated date for a KEP. With the stable field of the milestone struct, I have an idea of when the SIG or sub project was targeting that KEP for stable, right? Or when they're targeting it for beta or alpha, right? So with this data, we can even if it's not perfect, it's more than we would have had before, and that's the kind of data that we can start to aggregate into. Well, here's everything that's planned for alpha during this time frame. Here's everything that's planned for beta, so on and so forth. And this is essentially the work that the enhancements sub-team of the release team does, right? But they do it manually. So we want to move away from that manual phase and move into something that's more automated. Multiple panes of glass. There will be I know we like to say single pane of glass, but there'll be multiple viewing points for KEPs, whether you want to analyze them from the command line, whether you want to analyze them just by sorting through the repo, whether you want to view them on a website. That will be eventually possible as well. So and all of that stuff is rooted in the metadata and validation of the metadata that is within the K enhancements repo. So any questions on that? Hello, David, by the way, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure, I'm David Eads. I've worked on API machinery and SIG Auth, along with some stuff in CLI and apps, and I'm interested in just seeing where this project is going to go. I plan to sit and listen for a while first.
Awesome. Well, welcome, David. So for people on the call, David is one of our senior contributors. He's been an approver for quite some time. I don't even know how long.
About 6 years.
6 years.
since the beginning.
Since the beginning, the dawn.
The dawn of Kubernetes.
Yeah. So definitely super valuable to have you here in the meeting and eventually talking about some of the process improvements that we can do. I think that's hey Kat, I'm on a call. So we've got I think as part of prod readiness, as part of KEPS, we also tend to not talk in sense of experience reports, right? There is a field on there's a field for KEPS for experience reports within KEPS to allow people the opportunity to or multiple fields. One to allow people the opportunity to write user stories for for our the various enhancements, and then also fields to provide an opportunity to talk about user experiences. So if you've seen again, going back to the Python PEPs, the Rust RFCs, as well as the Go experience reports, those will give you some nice ideas about how we report back the information that users are gaining from our experiences with those enhancements. I think it's important to deliver a stronger feedback loop between the users who are utilizing the enhancements, as well as the people who are building them, so that we can ensure that over multiple phases we have a better idea of how we should be building for our consumers, right? So I definitely think that is a part that we're not focusing on as much as I would like to. Okay, all right. But that is, I think I've talked out vision for a little bit. So any questions on this stuff before we move into what was on the agenda?
I mean, I think one thing I wanted to mention is I haven't seen this back in this kept process review, so maybe there's some of this in there, but like I think we should get back to thinking about, in order to determine what changes, if any, we want to make with Article U, we should think about who the different personas are. So like we have the developers who are having to write caps, and what's useful to them and what's burdensome and what's not. And then we have the enhancements team. We have, I think you talked about like the idea of being able to generate a roadmap of some sort for consumption by media or whoever. So I think if we thought through some of those different personas, that would also help us sort of suss out the requirements for the process. Just wanted to bring that to the attention of the group. That I think that's a good place to start.
Absolutely, totally agree. And you'll see a little later that we've started to do some of that work. But before I continue, wanted to see if there are any other comments before I jump into that stuff. Okay. So next up on the agenda, we have some work done by various PMs that are newer to the project. What we wanted to do was kind of get an opportunity to take to have some beginner eyes on the process. And Lori Apple, who is program manager for SIG release, has kind of corralled a bunch of product and program managers to take a look at the KEP process. And there's a doc linked in our notes, and Katie's trying to kill me. But I'm going to share my screen really quick. John, if you want to hand me screen share, or if you want to share it yourself, you can do that too.
It's probably easiest just to promote to host.
Yeah. I have the power. Okay, right. So I was referring to, yes, this KEP process review. So they met earlier in June, and I think they might have had, I believe they might have had 1 or 2 meetings. But user stories, John, to your point, was one of the things that they talked about. Finding out what value we're adding to the KEP process. Some of the chatter about KEPs maybe they need to be smaller, easier to consume. I think that one of the goals for this sub-project in general is, as well, is to accelerate merge velocity for KEPs. I don't think that we should be responsible for the content the technical content specifically of an enhancement, but I do believe that we should find ways to make sure that we're essentially greasing the wheels and making sure it's possible to merge these things when they're ready to get merged. So there are at any one point, there are right now we have 207 open issues. So these are actively tracked. They may be enhancement related issues, or they may be KEPs. Most of these are KEP enhancement tracking issues. And then we have 127 open pull requests, right? So some of these are specifically related to the enhancement subproject, and some of them are specifically enhancements, right? So KEPs. And you can see if we were to, let's sort by oldest, right? We've got stuff that's been open since December 2018, right? And this goes back to the point of we need to make it easier for reviewers and approvers to do their thing. This is not just an enhancement subproject thing. This is a community-wide problem of reviewers and approvers being oversubscribed in multiple areas. So automation can help with that. Better process can help with that. The right people in the right places can help with that. The SIG release, we're kind of testing something out right now. So I think we're the first SIG within the community to establish a program manager role. The idea behind that will Lori Apple, she's doing a great job right now of kind of analyzing what SIG release does day to day. She started within the release team, since that's kind of like the ingress point for a lot of people's interactions with SIG release across bug triage, CI signal, the enhancement subproject, so on and so forth, and trying to analyze ways to make us better, right? I felt that if some work was started there, it would kind of reverberate throughout multiple areas, since we touch multiple areas in the community. And that was the production of this doc was part of that. So Lori got together with a few PXM folks and started looking at the enhancements repo and just tearing it apart. Honestly, suggesting some improvements for us to make. Definitely the user stories. I think that's a big piece that John had mentioned earlier. Talking about best practices and improving the user experience overall for KEPs. And then we can see that there are a lot of open questions around the process. So subproject owners, I would like you to take some time to comment up this doc, so we can start generating some ideas and turning these ideas into actions. Any questions on this stuff? All right. All right, so next up on the agenda is to discuss KEP CTL. So Jeremy and Bob, I think you have probably been poking at this the most. Do you all want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So Bob and I have had lots of discussions since 1.17 about the enhancement process and things we can do better. And the document that's in the agenda is something that Lori again put together, and has a whole bunch of notes that she collected by talking to Bob, and I think also by talking to people from previous release teams. Like we did a couple of those prioritization sessions where she talked to people from the current release team just asked questions and gathered feedback. So inside of that document, it lays out a couple of high-level user stories. So things around like, I'm a KEP author, I want to create a new KEP. How can tooling help me do that? Same thing around validation, and then some thinking around what a promotion process might look like. So instead of do the current strategy where we go into the issues and we comment and say like, this is going to be in 119 or this is not going to be in 119, moving to a more formal kind of ticketing process. And that's laid out a little bit inside of there. So KEPCTL was an attempt at just kind of pulling on the thread of one of those things, just kind of automating the process of starting a KEP. So we have the KEP metadata template and the README template. How can we take those things and turn some little automation into that? How can we, create the scaffolding for somebody to start working on one of those things? And then how can we also, validate that the pieces are there before somebody submits an MR? Kind of building on the KEPVal tool that's there. So it's written in Cobra, or it's in Go using Cobra, the CLI framework. And I think we're at the point now where we've got like that basic functionality, and I think it would be good for everybody to review this document that Lori's put together and comment on it if you haven't already. I think I saw some comments from Bob in there. And then I think it would be good for us to build like a roadmap out to think about what process changes do we need to put in place, and then what things can we add to that tool to help those process changes along. I think we have a fairly good idea about like what the process looks like for creating a KEP, validating a KEP, but I think we should spend some time kind of fleshing out what the ticketing system looks like. What does it look like when we want to specifically promote something from like alpha to beta in a certain release? How can we leverage pull requests and reviews and all the good stuff that goes along with working out of GitHub to make that more of an official process? Do you have anything to add to that, Bob?
Sorry, I was jotting down a note.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's all good. The original doc was honestly a collection of a whole lot of conversations in Slack. And then Lori cleaned it all up. You honestly, you pretty much covered everything I can think of off the top of my head.
So I'll layer some history on this. So I think it's important to note that we had this, Jeremy and Bob came to me with this idea of KEPCTL, and I said, this is something I presented in KubeCon like 2 KubeCons ago. So the idea for KEPCTL was initially Caleb Miles's, and as well as the idea for the ticketing system. So I had spoken to Lori about this, essentially what this ticketing system would look like. We were on a SIG Friday unofficial Cube Friends Hang call, and started chatting with Lori as well as Paris about KEP tooling overall. And in the ticketing system, the idea for the ticketing system is essentially to remove the need for enhancement issues, for the back and forth interaction between the release team's enhancement subteam and enhancement owners overall. So you can skip the doc if you want to, talking a little bit about how the receipts system would work. Essentially, we have buckets, very similar to the way that we handle the releases within the SIG release repo right now. Essentially, when we have a new release, we create a new a bucket for that release. So 119 is the current one, and within that subdirectory contains listing of the milestones for that release, the exceptions that might be contained within that release, the release team assigned for that release, and so on. So this would be similar-ish format for the K enhancements repo. There would be releases, 119, 120, what have you, and within each of those subdirectories would be accepted, proposed, and maybe one other folder that I haven't thought of yet. But the proposed, as an enhancements owner, when you are interested in proposing an enhancement to the release cycle, you would submit a ticket, right? A PR in the form of a ticket, which it would be a small piece of YAML that would be, hey, this is the enhancement we're talking about. This is the level it's moving to, and these are the people you should contact. This is a link to the enhancement, right? So something very lightweight that represents your commit for the cycle for that enhancement. Those enhancements would live in that proposed PR for a little bit. At which point, closer to the enhancements freeze, those PRs would get merged, right? Those PRs would get merged as proposed, and once enhancements freeze hits, some piece of automation would come over and move things from the proposed bucket into the accepted bucket, right? So now we have an accepted list of all of the enhancements that we intend to commit to for the cycle, right? That's something, again, that's something that we can start building roadmap off of, right? This sort of obviates the entire need for the release sheet, the enhancements tracking sheet at the beginning of the cycle, because it becomes PRs. There's no chatter back and forth between the sub-team and the enhancements owners. It's just, we want to commit. Someone from the enhancement sub-team approves the PR, it goes in, we call it a day. Automation moves from proposed to accepted. Anything past the enhancements freeze, it's no longer a question if it should be proposed for exception. We know that because it's not in the accepted bucket, that it is an exception, right? And that makes it easier to think about exceptions and think about exception approval. If it's something that needs to be approved as an exception, that becomes a PR, right? That becomes a discussion on a PR and a merge from a release team lead, sub-team, enhancement sub-team member, what have you. And that makes it a little easier to track. There's no longer a matter of tracking exceptions in a separate place, not utilizing that YAML file that we track exceptions in, and having and maybe not losing the discussion about an exception within a mailing list thread, right? As a PR, it's very clear about what the intent is, right? And whether or not it gets accepted is whether or not the PR merges, right?
Hey, Stephen, as part of this process, one thing I think that would be helpful, one of the other things the enhancement team does, right, is it's pinging all of the people to say, hey, it's validating, say they've done the test plan, they've done the PRR questions. Like, if we can validate any of this automatically, you know, again, trying to reduce toil for that team, and then you could have a, you know, your CI could say this is ready to promote or not into the accepted bucket, I think would be really helpful.
Yep. That's actually outlined in the kept notes doc.
Okay, I guess I just have to read that.
that was something like I specifically called out originally and all.
It's like, do you have a test plan? I don't know.
Test plan?
Yeah.
Question mark?
Yeah. And I think that, you know, with the test plan, it's important to, like, we have fuzzy borders around some of these things that we request. So, you know, making it YAML, making it like yet another YAML file, but making it YAML, making it something that we can validate, makes it very concrete to someone updating a KEP, right? If your PR gets blocked on a pre-submit, there will be reasons why it gets blocked on the pre-submit, and it'll usually be related to something being off with the KEP metadata, right? So we've been adding more and more of those validations across the last cycle and change. And I think that we're at a baseline point right now. It has a few expectations of you, that the KEP is named, it's numbered, it's, you know, it has a working link to an enhancement tracking issue, that it has a latest milestone, maybe. do we have current or latest milestone, I think, validation now? And
I don't think so.
no? Oh, darn. So coming soon, that's one of the next things that we probably want to do. But I forgot exactly what the phrase was, but it's an API should be hard to use and incorrectly, right? So we want to essentially make it impossible for people to file bad KEPs, or at least file bad metadata for KEPs. So little by little, we're getting through an improvement of the KEP metadata, and the reason that we put so much focus on fixing the metadata is, again, we want to make it hard for people to use incorrectly, but we also are going to use the metadata to inform the other ways that we interact with KEPs, right? So if you take KEP-CTL as an example, right, we want to make sure that KEP-CTL does the thing it's supposed to do. If it's create a KEP, if it's promote a KEP, those fields need to be correct for it to be able to do its job. And the second part of that is the website, right? So when there is a KEP website, which we should move on soon, the KEP website will be reading everything from KEP metadata, right? So it's important that, again, that stuff is correct. And having these multiple panes of glass to view KEPs in will, one, be easy for people who like different presentation mechanisms for processing data, and two, it will allow more people to see the work that we're doing and suggest improvements. So I think we've got a ton of information here about how we can improve. I think that we're going to take the time over this cycle to process more of that information, get more hands involved in this process, and yeah, hopefully have more fun creating KEPs, reviewing and improving KEPs.
So along those lines, and tooling wise, Lori said that she had a few people reach out to her interested in contributing to some of that. I think that I think she was slightly concerned that people would need to have more intimate knowledge of the enhancements process. But I think we can probably come up with some issues and prioritize them, like treat it like a real project, and have enough context in there that we can entice some new contributors to come and work on some of that stuff. So I think as an action item for myself, next week, next 2 weeks, I'd like to try to maybe spitball some ideas of what that might look like, and then we can review them like asynchronously or whatever.
I would say, as a first step, I would like us to make sure that we've all gone through these notes as well as the process review, because I think that conversation that you had with Lori came from a conversation that I had with Lori, which was essentially, I don't think we all have the same vision about what the KEP-CTL tool needs to be yet. So I think we should baseline on what we want this tool to be. Because it doesn't need to be everything, and maybe on some levels it doesn't need to exist, right? The initial idea for the tool was that it would be the single command line interface that you could use to create, promote, process KEPs, right? I think from the promotion standpoint, maybe that's not as valuable. The tool was supposed to also allow you to be able to review KEPs. So as a reviewer, you could hit KEP-CTL review or something like that, and it would add your name as a slot in the metadata that said you were a reviewer, and process your changes. And I'm not sure that fits nicely into a GitHub workflow. That it's maybe even a thing that we would want to build. So we need to figure out what we do and don't want the tool to do first. And I was telling Lori that I'm afraid of bringing people in to work on just like, hey, go work on this feature, and we're like, we don't actually need the feature. So I think that it's really important that we align on what we do and don't want the tool to do before we do anything there.
So that actually hits something that's that I think is an interesting point. Like, do we actually want this feature. There is one point of view that says the fact that people create enhancements and go through that process means there's a need for a feature. There's another point of view that says maybe the fact that we aren't merging that many of these indicates that the SIGs aren't in agreement that it's a feature that we need. And it is socially awkward to close someone's cap. I don't think I'm the only one that feels that way. There is often some amount of emotion invested by the KEP authors because it does take them a fair amount of time. It is something they obviously thought was important. And a reaction of, yeah, we're not going to get to this and we aren't going to devote our review time to merging it, can sometimes be hard to hear. Is there a doc or some sort of education that gives a graceful, like, here is a graceful way to say no, that like SIG leads should watch, because those are usually the people who are in charge of reviewing and approving. I think those are the right people, but they're also in charge of saying no, and many times that can be hard, and so they'll just let it linger.
So I love this. I love this because I think that from the perspective of a submitter of a cap, right? You've also got multiple perspectives in like assessing a cap, right? And one of them is maybe we don't need it because something like it already exists, right? And maybe the person who's writing the cap doesn't have the context to know that that thing exists already. But the first part of the process is supposed to be socialize this idea with a SIG, right? You're supposed to get a pulse on whether or not your cap is a good idea before you write it. So I would advise SIGs first and foremost to make sure that one, their contributors know that they can do that, and two, that we might not necessarily be reviewing content that wasn't pre-approved in some sort of discussion. I think that the way that I really like the way that I'm a little bit more loosey-goosey with my meetings, but I like the way that architecture handles their meetings. It's something, the topic is proposed on the mailing list, right? And it's kind of like, okay, let's keep discussing this before it ends up as an agenda item, and the idea is kind of similar with the caps. Sorry,
Yeah,
John.
yeah. If I could say, I think that what you just said, Stephen, that the process should be socialized first. Like, I think we could build that into the process better, right? So that, like, one thing we talked about, I don't know, a while back on some PR comment issue, I think David put the issue comment in, it was like, maybe we need to assign like a shepherd to any given cap from the SIG. That's one of the SIG leads, or either a tech lead or some bar. I don't know what the bar is, but like, we can, if a cap comes from a new contributor or somebody who has not been contributing a lot, like it like I said earlier, might not get the scrutiny that it needs early enough, and then they end up investing a lot of time. So if the process, like, we have this process, GitHub doesn't necessarily lend itself well to this. Like, we have the merge quickly, and we leave these unresolved sections. But like, the visibility of that's really not great. So like, I think we have to, if we can build the tooling or even the documentation of the process of, like, first just send this out, maybe on a mailing list or maybe in a PR, and then you have to use that to get somebody in the SIG who can commit the resources behind, to the review and approval resources to it, to give it a thumbs up before you get to the next stage. That could avoid a lot of having to say no after somebody's invested a lot of time and energy.
So this is tossing more things into the metadata, but what about forcing a field where you have to provide a link to essentially something like a mailing list thread or issue where it's previously discussed and it's not accepted if that's blank?
Maybe I'm not bringing it up because I have a great solution, bringing it up because I don't have a
Yeah. Well, it's starting the idea of how do we tackle that sort of thing.
It doesn't mean
We're-
that any of the things you guys are talking about aren't important. I'm just throwing it on the list as, hey, also, I can think of some cases where I think things have languished because no one really wanted to be the guy to say no.
Nobody wants to be the bad guy. Yeah,
S-
say, hey.
So there is there's kind of a mechanism that we have for this already that I don't see a lot of people using, and that goes that's the KEP statuses, right? You can merge a KEP without approving it, right? There's a proposed status. There are also deferred statuses as well as rejected statuses, right? I'm not sure I've ever seen a rejected KEP. So like a rejected KEP should be still committed to history.
I don't think there is one.
I have one I'm going to abandon. One of my caps that we just never made progress on and decided it wasn't worth the effort. So I'm gonna be the one abandoned cap in there, I think, soon.
So I think so the idea of the KEPs was to also commit information to project history, right? The way that we commit to history everywhere else. And part of that is not just taking the ones that we've accepted, but also the ones that we've rejected, right? It's okay to merge something and say, we're not going to do this, right? And flip the status to rejected, right? For the sake of having that in the project history. Because, invariably, a year later, 2 years later, maybe just a cycle later, someone's going to say, hey, I had this really great idea, right? and you'll be able to say, well, we've discussed that in PR, yada, yada, yada. It's in this KEP. There are some of the drawbacks that we logged because of that. And that's the reason that we decided not to go in that direction. Or maybe it's something that provides context for future discussion about how to build that enhancement better. But without it merged, with it as an abandoned PR, we don't get the opportunity to do that, right? So we do have to get people more okay with saying no. I think saying no and merging something as rejected is going to free up a lot of time instead of holding all of these KEPs that are inactive in your mental backlog and attempting to process them. So that's my thought on it.
One other possible idea to sort of expand on that.
Sorry to interrupt. We're out of time.
We're at time. Yeah.
Yeah.
David, do you want to jump in for the final word?
No, just to say I'm real glad this is happening. The things I've been hearing seem like the things that I would be interested in focusing on and seeing the results of. I don't know that I have a whole lot of time to devote to helping. Sorry, guys.
All good.
All good. Thanks for hanging out.
He's just going to come in and throw requirements on us, and then he's going to.
Yeah, I'll be that guy. Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, it was a pleasure to hang out with y'all for the first official enhancement subproject meeting. We will catch you at the next one in 2 weeks. Later.
All right. Bye. Thank you.